Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this important and timely webinar. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the President and CEO of the Pacific Council. It's great to be here. A little over a week ago, Mexico's Congress approved a major constitutional reform of the country's judicial system. The reform transforms the system into one in which judges, including Supreme Court justices or ministers as they're known in Mexico, will be elected by the general public. In addition, the Supreme Court itself will be modified, and the requirements and qualifications to become a judge will be changed so that they are less stringent and exacting than they are today. The reform was approved in both chambers of the Mexican Congress with a two-thirds majority, reflecting the current distribution of power in favor of the governing Morena party, with a couple of defections from the opposition making a key difference in the vote. This reform has severe and far-reaching implications for Mexico's democracy, its rule of law, investment climate, and of course, its international relations. I'm delighted that today we have three extraordinary experts with us on Mexican politics, its legal system, and its economy. I'd like to thank, first of all, Alejandra Palacios for agreeing to moderate today's conversation. Alejandra is a highly valued member of the Pacific Council community, is working closely with me at the moment on relaunching our Mexico initiative, and is an expert in her own right, bringing with her decades of experience in Mexican policy and public affairs. I'd also like to welcome Carlos Elizondo, one of Mexico's leading voices on politics and policy, and a good friend to me over many years and a new friend of the Pacific Council. Last but by no means least, welcome to Francisca Pou Giménez, a senior researcher at the Institute for Legal Research at the UNAM, Mexico's National University, and one of the country's authorities on this reform. Thank you, everyone, for joining the session today. Thank you to all members of the Pacific Council staff who made this possible. And please continue to engage online and in person in our programming and events. Alejandra, I turn this over to you to give a more complete introduction.
Thank you, Duncan, for the introduction. And Carlos and Francisca, thank you very much for agreeing on having this conversation with me. As Duncan has said, the judicial reform has a huge impact on Mexico's democracy, on Mexico's international affairs, specifically with our relationship with the U.S., because it might have some impact on the USMCA, and it also has impact on Mexican economy. So before dwelling into those issues, I would like Francisca to give us, I don't know, between 5, 6, 7 minutes, a description, facts of what does this reform do? What does it mean? And then I will ask Carlos to explain us how that unfolds in terms of economic and political and international affair consequences.
Okay, thank you so much, Alejandra, the Pacific Council, everyone. I think I will try to summarize the contents, but I think it's important to give the audience this scenario. The thing is that this is not an isolated reform. I mean, we will see it's serious enough from the perspective of the contents. But I think one of the reasons we are so worried is because we come from 6 years of a pattern of institutional degradation, right? It's not isolated. And the reform is not isolated in the package of reforms that is under consideration now. And this package includes not only the judicial reform we are analyzing today, but also the elimination of several independent agencies, and specifically the transparency one and the 2 antitrust agencies, the electoral reform, and the reform on the National Guard, like placing this body under full military control. So we are not going into that now, into this larger pattern, but I wanted the audience to know that, there's a much broader scenario that is being, discussed and that worries us. As for the reform, it is important to see what the reform does in the system and what it does not. As Duncan was saying in the initial remarks, the reform does not address any of the elements that in our diagnosis, in NGOs, the academy had, been identifying as the urgent sites for desirable reform. The prosecutor, for instance, that is without doubt the thing that works worse in the system of administration of justice in Mexico that was not touched in the 1995 reform is not addressed. The procedural complexity of many things in Mexico, starting with amparo, is not touched. The problems with, ineffective police bodies is not touched. The problems of insufficient access to justice, the problems of, the need to reinforce the public offices of legal aid is not addressed. So I say this because if you listen to what the politicians have been saying when voting on this reform, this has been really like, a post-truth delirium, because they were all saying, of course, and the president as well, this is the reform of the transparency, independence. This is the reform of the people. And if you see the contents, there's nothing associated to this agenda, So this is, I think, is also important. So what the reform does, the reform, it mandates first the dismissal of all current judges in the country and their replacement by popularly elected judges in 2 batches. Half of them in an extraordinary election to be held in June 2025, and the other half in June 2027, overlapping with the midterm election. This means, and this is important, this is far more radical than Bolivia or the US. It is all the judges in the country, all federal judges, all state judges, all electoral judges, and of course, including Supreme Court, Electoral Tribunal, all the high courts, including the new created disciplinary court. So this is more than 7,000 posts being, subject in two batches at the popular elections. The only courts that are not included are the courts that are already under the control of the executive organically. This is the bureaucratic courts, the land courts, and the military courts. The election, so if you want, I can expand afterwards on the differences with the US state judges elected by popular vote or with Bolivia, but I leave it like that. This is far larger and more radical. The election is organized on the basis of lists of candidates presented by the 3 branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will be also elected, after this first election. This will be the only Supreme Court that will not be elected, like presenting lists to the ballot. To get on the list, there is a selection committee. The reform says it is comprised of 5 members with recognition in the legal profession, but it does not identify the way these experts will be appointed. And these selection committees will supervise curriculums, right? And here is where the requirements are very basic. We are coming from a system of judicial career with a lot of examinations, written and oral, etc. Now the requirements are a law degree, which is very easy to obtain because here the regulation of the profession and of universities is very low. So there's a lot of, law schools of very disparate quality. And then the Constitution says you need to have an average point of 8 or 9 for the subjects associated to the functions to be fulfilled. And then you must present a 3-page essay saying why you want to be a judge, and 5 reference letters from neighbors, colleagues, or other people, says the Constitution, that can speak good about you. And then if the selection committee has more CVs than slots that, the branch can elevate to ballot, they will be a draw, a lottery, right, to reduce the amount of qualified candidates. And then there's the logistics of all this. We can go into the detail, Alejandra, afterwards. But for instance, for those of us that live in Mexico City, this means that this list, we will have more than 1,000 names in the ballot, right? Because of the amount of posts that must be covered. But then the candidates must run an electoral campaign. This is one of the more problematic things as well of the reform. There's no money allocated. They cannot have public or private financiation. They are guaranteed spaces in TV and radio, But of course, we don't know, we don't have a clue about how these campaigns will progress, how it will be possible for you to be a judge if you are not backed, by political majorities that, in the end are those that put you in the list. And of course, we have great worry for the illegal money coming into these campaigns. Another thing is that the judiciary will not be an option for life. Now with the judicial career, you compete in a contest and then you are judged for the rest of your life if you are ratified, whatever. Now judges will be only for nine years, and they can be re-elected if they want to repeat all this process. And the Supreme Court, well, the justices of the Supreme Court will be for 12 years. And the members of the discipline court, 6 years, but for general judges, 9 years. Another very important point is that the figure of faceless judges has been created, jueces sin rostro. This was a figure the Fujimori put in Peru and in other countries. There was some experience around that. Is something that goes against the right to be judged by an independent, it's again human rights guarantees as set down by the Inter-American Court. They put these faceless judges as well for cases associated with organized crime, etc. Second, and I'm going very quickly, don't worry, I'm trying to finish quickly. The Judiciary Council disappears and two bodies are created, the administrative body and the disciplinary court. I will only describe the disciplinary court because it is also one of the most worrying elements. The discipline court has 5 members, also selected by popular vote on the basis of lists, again, elevated by the 3 power branches. And the problem with the discipline court is that it can act upon request of any authority or any particular individual and can investigate judges on the most ill-defined terms, like things like going against objectivity, professionalism, the public interest. So this is really a problem because it has a lot of powers. It can sanction judges. It can inhabilitate judges. It can communicate to the prosecutor that certain things seem to be happening to the effects of having judges enduring criminal proceedings, and they can communicate with the Chamber of Deputies to the effects of starting impeachment against judges. The only post that cannot be sent to impeachment directly are the justices of the only posts that cannot be sanctioned by this tribunal are the judges of the Supreme Court that must go to impeachment and cannot be inhabilitated by this court. And not only this, but 1 year after the election, the disciplinary court will run an ex officio review of the judge's performance, right? So then there's other things in terms of general effects of amparo, some fringe provisions, but I would say this is the main provisions. And now, I will stop now, but we can then explore the costs of this in terms of course, independence, how we can avoid this being subordinated to the political majority of the day, in terms of professionalism, in terms of uncertainty that I think it's large, and even in terms of impunity, and all the problems that we already have in the system. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisca. Your description is incredibly clear. I think I had never heard it so bullet point in terms of all that it implies. So basically, what you're saying is that they might destroy judiciary independence and also the capacity of the judiciary in terms of the technique, the career, the meritocracy system. I will ask you, but I want to give Carlos the microphone because, as Francisca has explained, I mean, this is the big overview, and there's a lot of questions because, this reform eventually needs to unfold into regulations, secondary laws. Elections need to come about, et cetera, et cetera. So there's segments of what's happening. So this reform passed, we're in this space where all these secondary laws and regulations and the elections will need to unfold, and then we'll see how the system works. But as we pass in time, also uncertainty sort of unfolds, and that uncertainty has economic implications. As Duncan said, international relationship implications. So what we know from now, Carlos, just of the constitutional reform, what's happening in Mexico in terms of political and economic uncertainty? And then we'll go back to how the secondary laws will unfold, if something can be fixed, if this uncertainty is only going to grow or can lessen. So like, I'll take you through time. Carlos.
Gracias, Alejandra. It's a great pleasure to be with the Pacific Council. Great summary of Francisca. So I think that when one hears what Francisca has just explained, the first question is, why does this guy want to do that? I mean, even if your objective was controlling the judicial system, there were so many other routes, simpler, neater, with less uncertainty. And the second question is, why these guys want to do it, and what the new president has been accepting something that would really cloud and make it extremely complicated for an already complex government in many issues. Why are they doing this?
Carlos, could you explain for those who are seeing us what you mean by this guy and the next president?
I'm going to explain it. These guys are first the president. Why does the president, outgoing president, willing to invest all this political capital in that direction? There are many hypotheses, and I won't deal into them, but the basic one is an ideological. He does believe that this will democratize the judicial system in Mexico because there were other routes for controlling the judicial system. And he believes, as he's showed in many other issues, that for him the details are not important. 6 years ago, he canceled a well-planned airport in Texcoco, Mexico City, and started without planning a new airport, which has been a major problematic decision in terms of aeronautic capacity of Mexico City. That's his style. But what is amazing is that an incoming legislature, which started the 1st of September, that was elected in June of this year, accepts almost without debate something that when you speak to senators and deputies, the few I know from Morena, they agree that it's crazy. I haven't found really anyone serious that would say this is a good route for anything. It's certainly not a good route for increasing the capacity of the Mexican system to give justice, etc. But it's not even a good system in terms of controlling better from the executive point of view, the judicial system. So it's really important to understand or try to understand that we're under the almost absolute control of the outgoing king, something that we've never seen before. The end of the sexenio was the end of the power of the president. This sexenio is really changing that logic, and we should be prepared not only to this reform, but to other ones, which might include, just to put this in perspective, prisión preventiva oficiosa for fiscal fraud. I mean, you go to jail while the courts decide you are guilty or not in something as ample and fully defined as fiscal fraud. So the uncertainties that this whole system is creating into the economy, and what Duncan explained very well, it's great. But the second question is, why is Claudia Sheinbaum accepting this? Because it's really going to mark her sexenio. And I think that she thought she hadn't the space to fight this. And so the implementation will be on control over with a very weak government, Claudia, that will be facing a major fiscal challenge, a major security challenge. It's worth underscoring that this is taking place in the middle of one of the worst end of sexenios in terms of the expansion of organized crime in Mexico's territory. It won't help into that objective, but it's even at the same moment when we are approving this, organized crime was fighting in Sinaloa without any government action. And in an economy that has been losing steam, that hasn't grown much in the whole sexenio, and that is facing a revision of USMEC next year. So I think that what investors are currently doing is starting to panic, or perhaps the word panic is not correct, trying to understand what's going on, trying to evaluate whether in their sector, in the line of business, how problematic is this, but no one really understands the implication. Francisca had 5 minutes only to explain you the procedures, but the big question is, how do you pass from system A to system B without destroying the capacity of the system of solving conflicts within the private sector and with the state? With this system, the likelihood of a private business winning an important case against the state is virtually zero, I think. So in that scenario, what we'll probably be seeing is a lot of fear. Businessmen in Mexico are under some very strange tension because 6 years ago, López Obrador's sexenio seemed to be starting as something very risky for businessmen because of the cancellation of the airport of Texcoco. But at the end, it was a relatively moderate sexenio in terms of policy. Businessmen thrived, no major expropriation, no major fiscal reform, no fiscal reform, and some fiscal issues for certain firms. But things work more or less well for big businessmen. So now, I think that when these things start to settle down, when we have a US government in next election and the USMEC starts to being discussed again, we're going to start seeing that the scenery in Mexico has changed dramatically. I think we can say we will be having very soon, or we are in the process of creating a new political regime, a non-democratic one, an authoritarian one, without separation of power, and with the control over the legislative power so ample that they can do almost any constitutional reform in the future. This is just, I think, the starting point, with a big question mark of how are Claudia Sheinbaum, the incoming president, and AMLO, the outgoing president, negotiate main issues, and for how long Claudia Sheinbaum will remain under this very tight constraint that AMLO has put her into.
Thank you, Carlos. So very, very interesting points. So you talk about, I find it very interesting that you say that when AMLO started his government, there was also a lot of uncertainty, and finally things went well. And truth be said, that business people in Mexico, they did well, and so did, not in the energy sector, but in other sectors, international companies that decided to operate in Mexico. It's also interesting, so it's interesting in the sense that, I mean, there was uncertainty then, there's uncertainty that now, maybe uncertainty now is being exaggerated, but maybe it isn't. And it might not be because of, you know, these constitutional reform and others that might come that will change the scenario dramatically. It's also interesting that you say that Claudia will have to operationalize this reform. So it's on her, it's her government, it's the Congress of her time who will need to write those bylaws. And she has been saying, or her team has been saying, that there are ways to make this reform, which sounds very dramatic, as Francisca explained, to make it less harsh. And so, Francisca, my question is, the uncertainty we see, will it stay, or will it be as AMLO? And is it true that Claudia and her team and Congress with secondary laws can make this reform less dramatic? less profound on the Mexican political system.
Yeah, well, first, let me say that I think there are several things that are very different now in the Mexican scenario as compared to 6 years ago. Because, I mean, the economy now, after, as you said, a pretty more or less standard, like, a good development or better than we expected, we have now economic problems in terms of debt, whatever. I'm not specialized on that. Carlos has raised it, and we know that. But we have the problems associated to militarization, but a militarization that has not been used to curb organized crime. So this is one of the craziest things, because we have the problems of militarization, because military rule is never like civil rule. But this militarization has not even been useful to gain peace in the territory. On the contrary, I think the problems with organized crime are much worse than 6 years ago. And then the administrative capacities in the country are also much weaker, because López Obrador has weakened extraordinarily all public administration, through the denial of appointments, through the education system and the health system have been extraordinarily weakened. So I think there's more uncertainty, and the problems we have are more serious than 6 years ago. This is why, as Carlos said, why doing this? This is one of the things that is breaking our minds as well, because, and yes, as Carlos say, there's one interpretation. This is irrational. This is a whimsicality of a president that, that puts the presidential plane on a lottery, these kind of things. But then if you have to reconstruct the rationality, it is the rationality of authoritarianism. It is the rationality of not wanting judges to judge the corruption of this administration, etc. So in fact, let me go to the second thing. In fact, it looks everything so unnecessary, so irrational, so dangerous on the top of all the problems that Mexico is facing, that in a way, this is in the drawer. This was presented by AMLO in February, but we were silent. Why? Because we trusted Claudia. We said, like the president-elect will stop this nonsense at some point. So, but surprise, surprise, after the election, she declared that this deserved like quiet consideration. The next day, President López Obrador said, no, like this is a popular mandate. So basically, Claudia Sheinbaum in this interim period has been not only she hasn't opposed, but she has been cheering the reform as well. So now our next hope, Alejandra, is, as you say, the secondary legislation. But I'm taking a break from hope and from optimism, because me that have this optimistic nature in the end. But this is the things that they already put in the Constitution are detailed to a degree that it's very difficult to redirect in secondary legislation. I forgot to say one thing that is part of the uncertainty, and we have to see how it turns. In the transitory provision, they say that existing judges can avoid the selection committee and can go directly to the lottery. And then if they are not like outside of the, if they get into the list before the lottery for getting rid of the additional names, they will be able to be there. But then they have this electoral campaign and nothing, so one of the things is, well, can it be all a bit better if many of the existing judges that have more qualifications, that some of them, we didn't say that, but some of the judges now are specialized. You know that, no? We have telecommunication judges. I mean, jueces laborales, after all these,
Labor judges, yeah.
Claro, la reforma laboral associated to the TMEC with the United States. So I don't know, maybe if this can be, the profiles of the judges can be in the end not that bad. I don't know, because even the existing judges, I don't know if they will be prepared to undergo a system with these electoral campaigns with a disciplinary court, like being able to criminalize their acts immediately. So I'm not optimistic. And one person, and on a technical level, if one person could go to the courts and say the secondary legislation is adding conditions for me to be a judge, and this is unconstitutional, you know, some people could oppose the additional requisites in the secondary legislation because it makes it more difficult to become a judge. So it could be considered unconstitutional. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So I don't know. Let me add one thing before turning to Carlos, one or to you. Now all this is being on the challenge in the court. You know, we have the implementation, starting with the implementation of this, but at the same time we have, of course, challenges by the judiciary before the Supreme Court, you know, the inter-American system. So it adds to the complexity that we have this. It's possible that these challenges will not lead to a lot of, I mean, they will just not all be whatever can be done at the level of you know, of declarations of illegality and constitutionality. But well, sorry, I am a bit like mixing a lot of topics, but the short thing is that I am not really confident. Maybe in the end they will add like guarantees, but the system is so expensive. Maybe Carlos can go into into how expensive will this be for the INE to organize. I mean, this is crazy how they will apparently like use the money on the trusts, on the that they are eliminating. I don't know. There are other details we can talk about.
What Francisca is referring to is that it's our electoral institution who will be in charge of planning the election of the judges in these two badges that she described initially. So Carlos, I mean, if you have an issue in court, I mean, if there's a case in court, you don't know today who is going to be, not who's going to be the judge, because you don't necessarily know who the judge is going to be, but you don't know the quality of the judge that will decide upon your case in the next year and a half. So everybody's talking about fiscal risks, labor risks, and especially risks for companies that their markets dwell around regulation, like if you're in a regulated sector, and also if you have a concession or a permit from government. As Francisca said, the Mexican judiciary system needed a reform, but there's also an agreement that at the federal level, judges sort of decided cases from a technical perspective, and the case of that explanation, for example, is energy companies that were operating in Mexico. They had an issue operating in Mexico, and they filed their amparos, and they had protection. And so that we don't know what will happen forward. Although, Carlos, some people say that if you're a foreign investor and you're planning to invest in Mexico, you should not be so concerned of this judiciary reform, because you can file, I mean, there's dispute arrangements under the USMCA, for example. So you won't necessarily need to touch Mexican judiciary system if you have disputes and you're a foreign investor. But I think it's more broader than that. So what are you seeing?
You are right. It's much broader. It's broader. And in that sense, investors are trying to understand it because it's so complex. And we've been in this phase of trying to retain some optimism based in this idea that Francisca just told us that Claudia will do something. Well, he did not do anything so far, and now her likelihood of doing something is extremely restricted by the Constitution. Just even if they were prepared to do it as perfect as possible, the transition is going to be a nightmare because we don't know how many of these judges would want to participate, how many of them will decide to look for their pension now because they don't want to play this game. There will probably be some sort of adverse selection. The ones that are less capable of gaining some space in the labor market in the private sector will try to compete. The most competent will try to retire. The most experienced, because they're older, already have a good pension and will try to have it. So it's going to be really something no country in the world has ever done. That in itself will be problematic with the most technically and competent government in mind, which is something we most likely won't have because the new administration is not only new, but will have at least half of the important positions on the hand of people that came from López Obrador's administration, which were not very competent from the start. So this will be done in the middle of a very complex budgetary discussion. The current government was relatively prudent fiscally for the first 5 years of their administration, but in this year, 24, the public deficit will be around 6 points of GDP, which for Mexico is very high, the highest in more than 20 years. So they have to do some sort of fiscal consolidation. In spite of that very ample fiscal deficit, the economy will be growing 1.5 or less. So the perspectives for the Mexican economy are bad. Therefore, the perspectives of income, of having enough taxes to fund Claudia's program is very limited. So in that very murky scenario, I think that most firms are going to be very prudent. We've already seen in the numbers of direct foreign investment, the absolute volume is more or less the same we've had in the last 10 years. When you look at who is investing in Mexico, almost all the foreign direct investment is reinvestment of profits. Almost no new actor come to Mexico because it was already very complex to understand the rules of the game with López. With this, is going to become even more complicated. And of course, some will argue that look for a foreign partner, and through SMEC try to gain some advantage through the kind of things you said. But that's extremely complicated. That is workable after you first have to fulfill all the local procedures, lose them all, show they were unfair, move into the final stage. And as you know, with USMEC, it's limited to energy sector and some of the regulated sector. It's not as open as it was in NAFTA. And then we have the big
USMEC is USMCA.
Yeah, thank you for the translation. The new NAFTA. And finally, we have the revision of NAFTA, of the new NAFTA. And it's not only the technical details of how much this violates the current trade agreement, but more importantly, I was ambassador to Mexico for Mexico into the OECD, and the main glue of the OECD is that like-minded countries work together to seek advantages through trade, new information, etc. The big question the US government is going to have is Mexico still a like-minded country? What is this telling about Mexico? Because no one can argue that this is going to create a more independent judicial system. No one can argue that this will create a technically more competent judicial system, a more honest judicial system. Everything is going to unravel. And at the same time, as you are much more knowledgeable than us in this area, these autonomous bodies that regulate competition, telecommunications, etc., are going to be destroyed, are going to be incorporated into the administration, probably violating the provisions of the trade agreement. And therefore, there's going to be a lot of discussion, I think, in in US and Mexico, how are we going to redefine the relationship between the two countries? Of course, we are strategic in many sense for the US, but the US also has its own political logic. I've heard this very strange, optimistic argument from Morena high officials would argue nothing will change because we are so strategic for the US that we won't be kicked out of the new NAFTA. I don't know. It's going to be, it will depend on who wins, with what political pressures, under what conditions the revision of the renewal of the treaty takes place next year. So I think that uncertainty and investment and investment are in a permanent tension. Of course, there are certain guys that will be investing because for them this environment might be more easy to manage. I'm pretty sure that the very, very large firms in Mexico are probably happier without an antitrust unit and solving problems with the government. We've seen an interesting expansion of Slim's interest in the oil sector, probably because he's going to solve his problems directly with Claudia Sheinbaum. But generally speaking, what I think we'll be seeing is a very limited interest in new investments in Mexico, and of course less growth than we could have under the extremely positive environment of nearshoring and friendshoring, which will probably not capture as we should.
Can I add something on arbitration?
Yes, of
Alejandra?
course. Yes,
Yes, I think one of the results of this, and that it will be very sad in a country with so much inequality, is that yes, the people with enough money will try to bypass the new system and go to alternative dispute resolutions, and we'll have this politicized, horrible system for the people that cannot afford arbitration and big business. But even for investors, big business, whatever, not everything can be subjected to alternative dispute resolution. There are legal prohibitions. There are some things, especially administrative one, tax-related issues. There are many things that you cannot bypass the system. You cannot go to a private dispute resolutor. So it's not true that nothing will happen because, we will have our private system with the arbiters. And especially because the criminal system will work so badly and it will be so politicized, it's very difficult for me to think that the business environment will not be touched by this, and by other things that cannot be bypassed.
And let me just add something. We already have a lot of cases that are being managed through arbitration process because of the trade agreements or for whatever reason that it was settled into the contract. And the other day, a major lawyer that specialized in this told me that just the potential liabilities for the Mexican state of the cases that are already being disputed are more than 50 billion US. So that in itself is not costless for the state, can be extremely costly, and at the same time damage the investment environment. So it's like the worst of all worlds.
So the scenario is quite saddening and worrisome, of course. We have a question here, and I find it interesting, is what is the counter argument of why they push this reform? Or, I mean, it's really just the president wanting to destroy the judiciary, having more discretionary. Isn't there a counter argument on why, people applaud this? Or, I mean, are we not seeing something, good news somewhere?
Can I go, Carlos, and then you? No, I think the people has been receptive to the lies being that this is an improvement. Because, of course, the judiciary has not a lot of accumulated social capital. You know what I mean? I mean, it's not true to me that the system was, it was nepotism and corruption. No, especially the federal judiciary had very competent individuals, as Carlos was saying, but for many people, the judiciary was not an actor like improving their lives, their daily lives. You know what I mean? And many people was like, so they really don't know, the judiciary hasn't, this must be recognized, that the judiciary never made an effort to explain to the people what they are doing for the benefit of the system, for the benefit of democracy, for the benefit of rights. So many of the voters or the followers of Morena don't know about the good things of the system and just believe that, that this is really a thing that will eliminate nepotism and corruption, whatever. On the contrary, the reform is very likely to increase political nepotism. I mean, there's a lot of nepotism in the political parties today, and this is one of the things we have been discussing. I think this is all explained by the fact that the system of justice, because of excess of justice problems, was not relevant enough for many millions of people in here that don't have a reason to go to the streets and defend the system as they had a reason to defend the INE. For the people, it was more immediate that INE was doing a good function. But so they don't have the way to see that this is post-truth, in the sense that, this is not really helping to the problems that we all know exist, but have been magnified by this president and are not being solved, but will be worsened by this reform. I don't know. This is what I would say.
I think that Francisca has helped us to explain why there's no social reaction as in Israel to try to stop such a strange reform. But the question is really different. The question is, why are they doing it? Is there something we are not seeing that might explain why, and therefore might have better implications than the mostly negative implications we've said? That's how I understood the question, Alejandra. And let me say the following. The motive, the deep down motive, first, bear in mind this is a decision of López Obrador. It's difficult to understand the way power has been centralized in López Obrador. When López Obrador was in the opposition, he was against the militarization of public security. They even celebrated at the beginning of this administration the fact that the Supreme Court declared inconstitutional a law that Peña Nieto enacted in order to give some legality to the militarization of public security. They were happy. These same left group people have voted without doubt in favor of a much more serious militarization that will be put into the Constitution and will really create another extremely complex situation for the new administration, and we're probably not helping addressing public security problems, but that's a different issue. So a lot of things depends on what López Obrador thinks about the world. He decided to do this aeropuerto, new airport, even though his Ministry of Hacienda, his Ministry of Public Transport, and the guy that coordinates his relationship with businessmen told him it was a stupid idea to do. So it's difficult in a country like the US, but you have Trump as a reference, to understand how much power has been centralized in Mexico, and therefore things depend on how López Obrador sees the world. Another example. In the midst of the pandemic, AMLO has this obsession about the system that was developed to give some health coverage to the poorest of Mexicans, El Seguro Popular. He decided to destroy that without having studied the alternative. And he did it. It was a major failure. That system has already been canceled because it didn't work. So it's difficult from the outside to understand the capacity of López to do things that go against the common sense. He was capable of solving the problem of distribution of medicines, in one mañanera, in one of his daily conference, he said, maybe we centralize all the distribution of medicines in one single place, and from there we can send medicines to all Mexicans through FedEx, as Amazon does, will solve the problem. 5 months afterwards, this stupid idea was already there. The mega farmacia was already working. It has never been, it's not helping at all, but it's working. So López Obrador first had this personal fight with the Supreme Court, because for him, the idea that the law is something independent from justice is incomprehensible. He has said many times, between the legality of an issue or the justice of an issue, I will always be in favor of justice. And in his view, for example, the fact that the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional the energy reform which he enacted to promote the public interest was a very deep grievance. So he had several other grievances against the Supreme Court, and he wanted to reform the system in such a way that no president would be facing that restriction again. He has this idea, and therefore this Tribunal Disciplinario has this principle that a judge that goes against the public interest, whatever that is, will be sanctioned. Not against the law, against the public interest. Who defines what is the public interest? The president. So I think that's like the main thrust. How to do that, that's a different question. Because if you wanted to control the judicial system, there were much easier ways of doing it. You would have very soon control over the Supreme Court, because justices are finishing their tenure. You can nominate the ones that are close to you. Therefore, you would have the presidency of the Supreme Court. Therefore, you would have the presidency of el Consejo de la Judicatura, and you would basically control the system. But here comes, I think, his ideological view of the world, this idea that the people have to choose, that it will be democratic, this will be a profound change in the way things are done in the world. And I think he believes this will gain him a space in history. And he has always disdained details and what experts say about the implications of his decision. And he's validated by this massive victory Morena had in last presidential election.
Okay. So, Francisca, to wrap up, what should we be expecting to happen in Mexico in the next 6 months in terms of the unfolding and operationalization of this reform?
No, it's impossible to predict. It's impossible to predict. Our best hope is that, because as Carlos just was saying, all this nonsense is part of a polarizing style of government. I mean, the fact that, as Carlos was saying, the López Obrador has, is governing through creating conflict, and polarizing and the scapegoating the judiciary has been central. The only hope is that because Claudia does not look to be like this kind of populist politician, that some of the things will improve, you know what I mean? But the amount of damage that has already been done and the amount of problems, urgent problems she will have, I don't know if this will make a difference, right? But I cannot predict what will happen over these 6 months. I can only hope that López Obrador will finally retire from the political scene, but we are not sure either. We are not sure, because he's breaking the rules of the Mexican political culture, that that the new president must be free, etc. But I would say the only hope is that at least we won't have this irrational, polarizing and daily creation of conflict just for the sake of political aggrandizement, just for the sake of political messianism. This is the only thing that can be an improvement, but I'm not sure if it will make a difference.
Carlos, do you expect that Morena will negotiate with other stakeholders, the judiciary system, businessmen, academia, NGOs, the unfolding of this reform in secondary laws. They don't have to because they have supermajority, but
That's an easy question, Alejandra. Morena, no. Morena is going to do whatever AMLO or Claudia, and that's the big question mark, tells them to do. Morena is not a space of where interests are have a voice, issues are discussed. That was amazing on the discussion of this major reform. The main argument at some moments in the Senate was, es un honor estar con Obrador. A porra, how would you say that in English?
yeah, cheerleading. The argument was, we'll do what the president says because it's an honor to be with him. So
exactly, yeah.
No discussion, just cheerleading the idea.
Cheerleading is the word. So Morena is not going to play that role. The question is whether Francisca's optimist again that López Obrador will retire to the private sphere. Highly unlikely. He's already signaled that his son will be in an important position in Morena. So that in itself is an extremely powerful signal that where power still lies. And Claudia, as you said, Alejandra, not only did not, or maybe Francisca, not only did not stop the reform, but has been a cheerleader in favor of the reform. So her margin of maneuver is extremely limited, and we'll have to try to understand how this bitter pill can be swallowed, because swallow it will be.
Okay, so what we have for Mexico is tons of uncertainty in the coming months.
Or some certainty. All these horrible things will take place. How will they work? That's where the uncertainty is.
Okay, so some arbitration, alternative dispute resolutions for investors, although not all issues like taxes, for example, can be resolved through alternative dispute resolutions. The unfolding of the secondary laws with, we don't know if Morena negotiating or not, the unfolding of that. We don't know exactly at the end of the day what the qualifications of the new judges will be, although probably they will be diluted. We don't know exactly if the judges that are today in place will want to participate going forward as part of that system. Maybe the best judges will decide to jump into the private sector. And so there's always this moral hazard issue. And with that, I think we've said it all, sadly, because I don't hear any good news.
Let's meet in 6 months and just
exactly.
And discuss. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Carlos and Francisca. Thank you for participating in this webinar. And as part of the Pacific Council, I very much appreciate your time, your experience, and your thoughts.
Thanks to you.
Gracias a las dos.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.